Hello everybody and welcome to a Python tutorial on how to use Flask. Flask is a little bit more complicated than Bottle and a lot less complicated than Django, so it's a good medium web framework if you're using Python. So let's just get right into it. And the first step to using Flask is installing it, because it's not built in with the Python standard library. And so what you want to do first is create a virtual environment by running python 3-m venv, and then call it something like flask. And once you've got that, you should see that the flask-env folder, and then just go ahead and activate it by typing source flask-env bin/activate. And if that happened correctly, you should see this. If not, go ahead and take a look at the video on imports. I've got a separate video for that. But I'm going to assume that it worked correctly and that now you are in the correct environment. So let's go ahead and install Flask with pip install Flask. Alright, that is good. So that's how to install Flask. And today we won't be using the same environment as we were before, just because this is on my server and we're just going to be learning about Flask locally and not how to actually host a web application. So we will be using PyCharm instead. And I've already got Flask installed on this virtual environment in this PyCharm project. So now that we've got it installed, let's go ahead and make a very, very simple Flask application. And that can be done just by from Flask import, let's see, Flask, easy. So before we do this, let's talk about what exactly a web framework is, because you hear that phrase thrown around a lot, and not a lot of people really tell what exactly it is. So a web framework like Bottle, Flask, Django is just a way to connect a regular programming or scripting language like Python to web requests. It's a way to program in a language. When somebody requests this route, go ahead and do this. So it's what handles the requests. Let's just get right into it. Maybe it'll make more sense. So we need to make an instance of the Flask class, and usually we call it app, and we're going to pass it an argument name, and that just gives it the name of the file. It's just good practice to do such. And then we're going to use what's called a decorator, app.route, and then we're going to give it a path. And then we define a function that we want to run when somebody goes to the given path, and we'll just return hello world, and then we'll do if name equals main, just saying only run this if we are running the file itself and not importing it. If name is main, app.run. And so this is a very rudimentary Flask application, but if you do run it, it should work. You can just run it like you would any other Python file, and you'll see something like serving Flask app main, environment production, running on this. You'll see something that looks sort of like a web address. That's just the IP address and the port that it's on. So let's go ahead and refresh here, and we can see that it says hello world. Now that's pretty neat. We run a Python program and we can access it with our web browser. Now that's kind of weird, and not something that a lot of people would think that you can, do. And Python is not alone in this. Like, every language has some web framework. Like, Rust has Rocket. JavaScript has Node, which is sort of similar to Flask. I've never used it personally, but I hear that it's sort of similar. Java has JSP. So there's all kinds. I think C++ even has something similar to this. So there's all kinds of things that you can do to sort of get a web browser to connect to a program. So let's say that we want something more interesting to happen. Like, we don't just want to have the root address of the website. Let's add another route. Say app.route. And when somebody goes to, I don't know, test, then we define the function that we want to run, and we'll call it test. It's just, it's also good to name these functions so that you'll know what resource is being accessed. And then in this one, let's go ahead and return time.time. And of course you will have to import time. So here's where Flask really shines with dynamic content. So we're not just returning an HTML page here. We are running this Python function and returning something from it to the web page. So once we save that and then rerun the program, let's go ahead and try to go to /test. Aha, look at that. We get an error. Wonder what that could mean. Let's go ahead and find out. So if we look here, we can see this error, but you won't always have access to the console. So if you say in this app.run debug equals true, instead of getting this, this error that tells you absolutely nothing, you'll get this, and it's a lot more helpful. So it says type error. The view function did not return a valid response, meaning we can't return an integer, or I guess a float. So let's turn that into a string, save, and it'll automatically reload, and we'll refresh. And now that is the time in seconds since January 1st, 1970. That's not super useful, but you can see if we refresh, it is different. It has changed. It's actually running this every time that we try to access this /test here, because that's what we told it to do. Now, let's say that we want something to be dependent on the URL. So to do that, you can do something called URL parsing. And what that does is it takes fields from the URL, and it can use that in these functions. So something that might be good, let's say app.route, add a new route, and we'll say greet / and then to make a URL argument, you give it a less than and a greater than symbol, and then what you want it to be called. So we'll say name. We'll just make a function that it'll greet somebody. So def greet, and here we have to give it the parameter as typed in the URL. So yeah, in the URL. So we will return hello name. And let's save that, and it will restart. And we'll say greet/JT. And it says hello JT, and we'll say Emily. And it says hello Emily. So this is dependent on the URL. So this can be useful in a few situations, like if you're making an API or something like that. This is one way you could go. I wouldn't say that it's necessarily the best. I would we'll get to a better way to do that. But for now, just know that this exists. And the next thing that we can do is limit the request type. So when you go to a website, what you're doing is an HTTP GET request. And there's all kinds of different request types. There's GET, POST, PUT, DELETE. There's a few others that aren't really as often used. But usually when you submit a form on a website, it submits a POST request, which is different than a GET. And we can actually specify which requests to allow. So let's go ahead and say app.route form /post. And for this route, we only want people to be able to access it with a post request. Like, let's say we have a form that we want people to fill out, and when they hit submit, it'll send the form information to this URL. But we don't want people to be able to go to this URL by themselves, just with their browser. We only want to use it as an endpoint for form submissions. So here we can say methods equals post. And then we'll say handle form. And we'll just do a regular print. Got form, and simple as that. And we'll make another route. Call that just the /form. And yeah, that's all we'll have. So we'll say def form. And so then let's actually make the page that will have the form on it. So to do that, we will say return, and we have to import something else from Flask, which is render template. And what this does is it takes a Jinja 2 template and it turns it into HTML. So let's figure out how exactly to do this. So templates are stored in the templates directory, which should be in the same directory as your main file. So let's go ahead and make a new file. We'll call it form.html. And so we'll just copy in a shell here. Just call that form. And in the body, all we've got is a form. And let's say we'll put an input type equals let's see, text, and name equals name. It'll just be somebody's name. I don't know. And there'll be an input, and then we've got another input. The type is type equals submit, and we need to make sure that we set the action Or is it the target? Let's find out. So when you're posting a form, when you're making a form, you need to tell it the endpoint. And so we've got our endpoint here. It's /form/post. So let's go ahead and give it that as the action. So when somebody clicks the submit button, it'll bring them there. So let's tell it form.html is what it should render. And now if we go to form, we've got a form. And we can put something in, hit submit. Method not allowed. That's interesting. Aha, you see this. Forms by default are their method is to get. So you gotta make sure that you tell it that the method is a post. So let's go ahead and try that again. We'll go back here, test2, submit, method not allowed. That's pretty strange. Probably just clear the cache. Test2, submit, type error. Let's see. You must return. Now let's say when somebody goes to that page and they submit, let's redirect them. So Flask has this redirect, and you just give it a URL that you want it to redirect to. Oh, I guess, yeah. Alright, so we have it reloaded. Refresh, continue, and there we go. Gore form. Good one. Got form. Now if we want to get that form data, what we can do is access request. Now that's another thing that you'll have to import. But from there we can say request.form.get and then name. So this request.form.get, that's just a method so that you don't have to access the raw dictionary returned in request.form. If you try getting a key and it's not there, you'll get an error saying, hey, the key's not there. But when you use this get, it won't return an error. You might want it to return an error, but for our purposes, we really don't. So let's go ahead and say jt submit, and there we go. We print got form, and then we print name, because we told it that name would be the name. It's a little bit confusing calling it name, but name would be the name of what is in the text. So that's how to handle forms. The next thing that we want to take a look at is a little bit more about templates. So this doesn't do much. Why are we rendering a template? This is not a template, it's just a simple HTML file. Well, the thing with templates, you can actually pass them Python variables and have them display. So if we wanted to, we could actually, once again, we'll go in here and we'll say time equals time.time. And so now we can use this time variable in this template. So let's go ahead and make an h1 tag, and in there we'll do double curly brackets and say time. Now these double curly brackets are how to say, I don't want to put HTML in here, I want to put something that Jinja 2 should turn into HTML. So let's refresh the Flask application, and then refresh this. And so that's another way, that's a way to embed Python information into an HTML page. So yeah, that's the basics of Flask development. Once again, I think I've said this before, but this is not exhaustive. This is not even close. This is just to get you started on the path to creating Flask applications. There's a lot more to know than this, but this will get you as far as you need to get if you're just making a really simple application. But Flask is very feature-rich. If you want to know more, definitely check out the Flask documentation. This tutorial was loosely based off of the Quick Start. This is the Flask documentation. They have a lot of documentation on how to use the library. They have all of these talking about response objects and message flashing, something we didn't get to. Sessions are pretty important. So yeah, this is the place to go. And a lot of people have developed sort of add-ons for Flask to make doing certain things easier, like working with SQL or working with users and logins, stuff like that. But yeah, I think that pretty much does it for this episode. If you have any questions, leave them down in the comments, and have fun.